Whew, now that was an episode of Invincible. Dear Lord. After a couple of slower paced episodes, which I felt the season desperately needed personally, the show is barreling forward at a breakneck pace into some of the most brutal and affecting stories the show has to offer. This one obviously portraying the Invincible War, something that the fans of the comics have been so excited about they have not been able to help but comment about it. And honestly, it did live up. This episode is absolutely bonkers, portraying some of the darkest and most brutal scenes in the show and challenging Mark in a way that I don't think he could have even comprehended before this. Spoilers for the episode What Have I Done ahead, and just want to once again kindly ask y'all not to spoil the comics for anybody in the comments. Thanks. Man, I do love the way this episode not only just accelerates the events of the season full speed ahead, but uses this massive crisis to challenge everything Mark has been struggling with this season. And fittingly, it starts with a flashback to the end of last season, revealing exactly what happened to Angstrom and how he's returned after Mark seemingly killed him. And it is a brutal sequence. They really get up close and personal with the carnage. It's gross. Not sure how much I can actually even show here. Probably have to blur a lot of it. I'm not sure I love the initial concept of how Angstrom survived. It is hard to believe that this is a living thing right here, but I guess it does also showcase his resilience, his strength, and of course sets up the technicians as he crawls into the portal and they put him back together. But as I mentioned in my last video, I do love the idea that Angstrom survived and that he'll be an ongoing foil for Mark. As much as I loved season 2, Angstrom was set up early and felt largely removed from most of the events of that season, at least until the finale, and it all felt very rushed and quick. It seemed like they were setting up a bigger ongoing baddie, and then at the end of season 2, I was kind of like, oh, that's it for Angstrom? He's dead? So for me, his return here is welcome, and I love that he's going to have this ongoing feud with Mark and that it's getting increasingly personal. And his plan is also pretty diabolical. We had seen alternate Marks back in season 2 and got a taste of how evil they can be, but Angstrom's plan to use these evil invincibles to not only absolutely decimate our Mark's Earth, but make the planet's citizens associate the biggest mass disaster event in human history with Invincible, bro, that is a lot. That is one way to get back at a dude. And we immediately see these alternate invincibles enter this dimension and start messing shit up. Also alongside the Angstrom drones, with Angstrom making his plan clear. Make them fear Invincible, make them hate Invincible. The sequence of events for Mark is even more insane because he's still grappling with the incredibly traumatic events of last week's episode. He's barely removed from it, having witnessed Powerplex microwave his wife and child and blaming himself for those events. He's reconciling with the ways his actions have consequences and still determining how he approaches his heroism with that in mind. But he doesn't even get a chance before probably the most insane imaginable disaster starts to occur, and he has to just get out there and get back into action. A couple dozen alternate versions of himself just straight up murdering and destroying every major city on Earth. I gather from the way people talk about it that the Invincible War spanned quite a handful of issues, and I'm curious if people will be upset that it's relegated to a single episode of the show, but I gotta say, I think the execution was really well done, dividing it out into the days in which the attack was ongoing, with things feeling increasingly dire the longer it continues. There's such a great escalation to how anxiety-inducing this event is across the episode. Honestly, I love this episode in general, but the thing I most want to hype up is Steven Yeun's absolutely top-tier voice acting. I've always been a huge fan of his as a performer, and even specifically as a voice actor. He's Speckle in Tuca and Bertie, which is one of my favorite comedic voice acting performances maybe ever.
Bertie, my sister, she's marrying a criminal? He's an animal, but does crime?
But the various flavors he puts on his performances as alternate Mark/Invincibles are really so great. They really feel differentiated, and he gets to show off his range even as different versions of the same characters. I would love to do a full-on showcase highlight reel here of these performances, but these Invincible breakdowns have actually been getting hit with these bogus copyright claims on the background music of scenes of all things, and it's not really worth risking, unfortunately. YouTube really needs to get a handle on their copyright claim system and prevent this kind of fraud, so I'm really sorry. But it feels like each and every variation of Invincible has a unique personality in this. We even see them clashing with one another at various points, despite working with the same goal in mind. There are some other really terrifying alt-Invincible moments throughout, too. It was awesome to see Oliver out there trying to actually help people, a far cry from the "some lives don't matter" attitude he displayed earlier in the season. But man, when he catches up to who he thinks is his Mark, only to find it's one of the alternates, really really scary moment. This smile on this Invincible's face, eerie as hell. Another thing that's pretty immediately established is that though these Invincibles are still among the strongest beings on the planet, none of them are as strong as our version of Mark, which I think is not only pretty interesting on a narrative level for this story, but in terms of what it means for how unique our Mark actually is. From the limited scope we have of Invincible's multiverse, is there really any other dimension where Mark stayed loyal to Earth and his friends? Basically, every other Invincible we see is full-on evil, whether that's the one we see in Season 2's premiere, or through all of these alt-Invincibles in Angstrom's army. But that also means that through the events of our dimension, through maintaining loyalty to Earth, through taking the more righteous path, our Mark becomes stronger than he possibly could have in any other dimension, stronger than he possibly could have otherwise. Obviously, I don't think this means other Invincibles don't have that potential, but the fact is that the events of our Mark's universe, the burden of the responsibility to be Earth's primary defender against the Viltrum Empire, is what motivated Mark to become stronger than he would have in any other scenario, which makes a lot of sense. In the dimension where Mark teams up with his father, they would share the quote-unquote workload, and he likely wouldn't train as diligently. There is one of these evil Marks that claimed he killed his Omni-Man, which means that that version of Mark would have to be pretty strong, and obviously these Invincibles are all still stronger than most every hero on Earth, but I think this says a lot about our Mark and his trajectory as potentially one of the strongest beings in world history, across any dimension. Lots of the Invincibles in the Invincible War are taken down ultimately, which is pretty wild. Cecil manages to kill one with the murder cyborgs and that Tony used to incapacitate Mark earlier in the season. Darkwing banishes one to the Shadow Realm, sacrificing himself in the process. And then, of course, there's Rex. Okay, let's talk about Rex. Man, this guy has become one of my favorite characters over the course of the show. What a journey from pompous asshole to lovable idiot who means well. We got one more little Rex and Ray sequence as he starts helping her move into her new apartment, and we see their chemistry on full display before the Invincible War shit starts hitting the fan. I really loved that Rex adamantly told Ray to stay behind. It tracks that since this is basically Ray's first non-hero day, that her first instinct would still be to jump into action when needed, but Rex really cares about Ray, and insisting that she stick to her plan shows how much he understands her long-term needs. And damn, Rex puts up a serious fight against this Invincible at the Teen Team headquarters, allowing Bulletproof, Rudy, and Amanda to escape in the process. I was kind of shocked by how well Rex did in this fight, briefly incapacitating the Invincible before we get the ultimate sign of his growth across the series. It's a really sad sequence, but Rex's sacrifice, exploding his entire skeleton and destroying this Invincible in the process, was such a great moment. This season, Rex talked a lot about his identity as a hero and how he doesn't really feel he has one outside of being Rex Splode. And so for him to sacrifice himself to save his friends and help protect the planet is a pretty great way to go out, in my opinion. Even though it is also kind of dark and sad. I'm really gonna miss the character though. Jason Mantzoukas gives a killer performance, and he's often some of the best comic relief in the entire series. It's a hole that's kind of tough to fill. I am, of course, assuming that he'll stay dead, since we've had so many fake out deaths, but this feels pretty definitive. It would be pretty lame to undo this sacrifice. Ray's moment driving and seeing the explosion in the base and realizing what has likely happened is really affecting. This leads into probably the best sequence of the entire episode, just a really emotional music montage showcasing the combat and carnage across the globe, showing dead heroes, dead Invincibles, characters cowering and embracing each other in fear. I think this show tends to use music really effectively, and this is among my favorite examples across the entire series. Even the shots of the dead Invincibles feel sad. It just highlights how unfathomably dark this scenario is. And this leads to another really great scene in terms of Mark's struggles as a character this season. Earlier in the episode, Eve's leg is snapped brutally while she and Mark are attempting to fight two other Invincibles. It was among the hardest I've winced at anything in this show. And so after that montage, we see Mark sitting by Eve's side at the GDA hospital, and I think this is really emblematic of what Mark has been going through across this year. This season, we've seen Mark sort of refuse to answer the call a couple of times in favor of being with his loved ones and living his life. We saw it last week with the Powerplex dilemma. We saw it in episode 4 when he initially chose his date with Eve over helping the twins with their future dictator problem. Here's Mark amidst the biggest crisis the Earth has maybe ever seen, as the person who can make the biggest difference in fighting that crisis, and he refuses to leave Eve's side. It's an age-old superhero question, but I like the way it's explored here. Can Mark make the right decision in terms of protecting the world if his priorities are actually the people he's closest to? Y'all play Spider-Man PS4? It's kinda along those lines of the big dilemma at the end of that game, when Peter had to make the choice not to use the antidote to save May so that they could replicate it and save the rest of New York. It's not new territory, but it is such a great conflict to throw these characters characters into emotional turmoil and really put their heroism to the test. It's kind of impossible to imagine the kind of mental fortitude it might take to leave your significant other unprotected like this, not knowing if you'll ever see them again. And I appreciate that Cecil is the one who tries to talk him into doing the right thing, trying to get it through to him that he not only knows what the right thing to do is, but that Eve would be wildly disappointed if Mark gave up his part in the fight on her account. But then we move on to day 3. The entire Invincible War started with a couple dozen Invincibles, and by day 3, there are actually only 8 left, which is pretty wild. The heroes who were left to defend Earth managed to take out way more of the Invincibles than I would have expected, like 2/3 of them potentially, and it's at this point that the rest are just fed up. I was wondering about this the entire time, how Angstrom managed to get this many Invincibles on board with his plan, and the answer is that he actually promised them all different things with no real intention on following up. This was all another interesting sequence showcasing the ways these Invincibles are all really different and have a variety of motivations and seemingly varying degrees of evilness. One of them just wants to see his mother again after she died in his dimension, which is a far cry from some of the others who claimed they gleefully killed Debbie in their own dimension. One just wants to see William again. But I think they play this right. It was already maybe a stretch that he'd be able to get this many Marks to cooperate, and this is where they just flat out stop. But Angstrom was of course prepared, stranding them in seemingly the same place where Mark thought he killed Angstrom in season 2. I cannot imagine that this is the last we've seen of these Invincibles either, so, eager to see when Chekhov's Invincibles fire. And this face-off between our Mark and Angstrom is a really great rematch. Angstrom has more at his disposal this time, seemingly being even more adept with his portals and utilizing the countless drones. Honestly, the way the drone swarms were animated was so cool. It's basically showcased like the gray goo hypothetical, except these bots aren't nano. It's kind of the same idea on a larger scale though. It just looks like a big glop of goo attacking Mark. And I love how the only real way Angstrom has to counteract Mark's strength is to outsmart and overwhelm him, which still doesn't work in the end. Mark breaking through the drones and reaching Angstrom is super satisfying. This event is going a really long way to make Mark question his own ideals. He outright says this later in the episode, so it's not like I'm doing any insane analysis here, but obviously he's been beating himself up about killing Angstrom since the end of season 2. And here he is, faced with the fact that by failing to kill Angstrom, he actually unleashed the absolute worst mass disaster in human history upon the planet. It's basically the exact same thing he was grappling with in regards to the Powerplex event, except scaled up times hundreds of thousands. He is faced with the unmistakable reality that if he had not failed to kill Angstrom, hundreds of thousands of people would still be alive. That is heavy. By trying to be the bigger, more righteous person, he inadvertently allowed mass murder to enter his dimension. But this moment, where he catches up to Angstrom, is where he's really faced with that reality, in trying to determine what he needs to do now that he's got Angstrom in his hands, with Oliver screaming in his ear that he needs to end him. But Mark's reluctance lets Angstrom get away one more time, of course, except for one arm. I think it's pretty clear to just about anyone, the man that facilitated the destruction of every major city on the planet alongside hundreds of thousands of deaths, that guy should not be alive. It's a shame Mark realized this a little too late.
Angstrom did this because of me. I can't ignore that anymore.
Even though it's easy to see how and why Mark has struggled through this season, it's also really easy to pin a lot of blame on him during these events. Obviously, he didn't even realize that Angstrom was still alive, but his refusal to go out and help when Eve was in the hospital was wildly selfish. He may not have realized that hundreds of thousands were going to die, but he should have had an idea. It's a great personal dilemma for the show to put him through, and it feels like the purpose of his refusal was to further beat the idea into his head that he has to change how he operates if he's really serious about saving lives. His fear of losing Eve probably cost tens of thousands of people their lives. I mean, let's be honest though, I'm glad that's not a scenario I would ever have to make that important of a decision in, because Jesus Christ, I don't know if I'd be strong enough to even comprehend it. But as a viewer, it's pretty easy to say, come on, Mark, what the hell are you doing? I'm fascinated by the future of Angstrom because now he seems to be a pawn in the pocket of these technicians who, through their medical and tech revival of Angstrom, have basically installed tools of control and will now use him for their own gain. Not the direction I expected the Angstrom story to go, but one I'm very eager to see the next steps of. What's maybe craziest about this episode is that it feels fully like a season finale. This was such an insanely massive event, and they even spend a huge chunk of the end of the episode sort of wrapping things up as though it was a season finale. Mark goes to help Oliver and other folks clean up New York, only for Powerplex to lose his mind that he's willing to show his face. This is such a sad sequence as they just hold Scott down until he decharges, particularly because at this point, you know Mark truly understands and even agrees with Scott's POV. Mark finally meets Eve's parents as they visit her in the hospital, and we get a direct reference to the Adam Eve special. Mrs. Wilkins is basically conveying how they had always been terrified of Eve being a superhero out of fear for her safety, but she reveals that Eve's childhood friend, Valerie, actually died in these attacks. This is the character we saw Eve grow up with and confide in back in the Adam Eve special. It was her only real friend who then turned on her entirely when she discovered her abilities. Such a traumatizing thing to happen to a kid, especially a kid who has nobody else. But it's an interesting moment of decompression from Mrs. Wilkins, as she also reconciles with the fact that they have far less control than they'd like. Even though she thought it would be safer for Eve to stay out of all the fighting and conflict, plenty of people who did stay out of it lost their lives. Immortal is resurrected once again and decides to quit being a hero outright and wants to start a family with Kate, which leads to this truly huge moment. Cecil asks Mark to lead the Guardians of the Globe. An understandable request made maybe more out of desperation than anything, and a real long shot given Mark's frustrations with Cecil this season, but it's very interesting to see how their relationship has sort of halfway repaired. Mark still doesn't trust Cecil, but he does recognize the dire situation they're all in, the dire situation that Earth is in. He won't lead the Guardians, but he will answer the call if they really need him. Because at this point, what other choice do they have? The planet is in bad shape. But you see what I mean? All of these events, they really feel like end of the story cleanup moments. Obviously though, this is not the finale, because the events of these last 3 episodes of the season are just unrelenting. Enter Conquest. God, what an insane narrative decision this series makes. Unrelenting really is the only word. Mark deals with one of the most personally traumatizing events in his superhero career with Powerplex. Then the biggest disaster in world history immediately strikes the Earth in what turns out to be something that Mark fully blames himself for. There's a death toll in the hundreds of thousands because of this. And do things quiet down after that? Nah. Enter the strongest Viltrumite that exists, here for the explicit purpose of taking over Earth. What a show, man. I have actually seen the finale, and it is absolutely insane. I cannot wait to talk about it next week. I do not think y'all are ready, but what did y'all think about the Invincible War? How'd you feel about episode 7? Are you excited or just anxious for next week's finale? Let me know below in the comments, and stay tuned for next week's breakdown. Peace.
I stay mellow watching Johnny Two Cellos. He talks cartoons, he's a really cool fellow. He keeps you posted on adult cartoons. If that's what you're into, then grab a spoon and a very big bowl of your favorite cereal. Feels like Saturday morning cartoon material. Johnny Two Cellos, watch him on YouTube. Now enjoy this groove and bust a move.